Welcome to Canadian Innovators, the show that celebrates innovation, entrepreneurs, and the Canadian spirit. I'm Jocelyn Bamford, and every week we introduce a new entrepreneur or expert in the economy to tell their stories and unpack the challenges of keeping jobs in Canada, as well as share ideas for economic growth and prosperity. Today on the program, we welcome back former Liberal Cabinet Minister Dan McTeague, President of Canadians for Affordable Energy. We will discuss a little-known group called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, also known as GFANZ, and what this means to small and medium-sized business, not only globally as well as here in Canada. Welcome back to the program, Dan.
Jocelyn, a good topic, and great to be here again with you to share some ideas on this little known but very powerful and very impactful organization that another creation of our illustrious Prime Minister Mark Carney.
So, Dan, before we dive into GFANZ, please tell us what is new with Canadians for Affordable Energy and what are you focusing on currently?
Well, we'll continue to drill down on net zero because all the policies appear to have disappeared, but in fact, they are still very much in place. And of course, it's been a summer of interesting notes on energy, given the three blockages, Black Sea, Red Sea, and of course, Straits of Hormuz. So that's having an impact. Canadians for Affordable Energy offers now the only national two-day gas price prediction, something I've been pioneered, 30 years ago. I know we have a few woke radio stations that try to find something else, but the reality is that we continue to try to provide people an opportunity to have this as a bit of a hedge against these higher prices, and a little bit of deeper digging, Jocelyn, on the issue of market manipulation to drive prices down artificially at a time of an energy crisis.
So, Dan, let's get right to us. Tell us about GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. What is it?
Well, this followed from the UN's climate agenda, going back to 2014, 2015, and it was really encapsulated by Mark Carney, who in Scotland at the one of the sessions, the yearly sessions of COP, Conference of the Parties, decided that they were going to provide a mechanism by which there would be a forced imposition of net zero policies. That's to reduce CO2, not fight pollution, but to actually just reduce CO2. And to do that, find strategies by which financial organizations would be compelled or at least persuaded to limit access to capital for pretty much anybody who didn't follow the diktat of the United Nations and its climate agenda. And as a result, the idea was to get all banks, all insurance companies, and all policies in sync towards making sure that anything that's produced, anything that is viable, anything that is worthy of financing would be conditional upon whether or not they're subservient to, and I use those words, to the climate religion that says that only so much CO2 can be produced. And to those who couldn't make the changes of technologies, pay the carbon credit market, for which we know many companies, including those which Mark Carney is very heavily invested in. Brookfield Asset Management has a significant portion, but it doesn't just stop there because it's really worldwide. Although we haven't had much discussion in Canada about it, the United States came awfully close to going after Mr. Carney himself and GFANZ just before he became Prime Minister, when the move to try to strangle oil and gas sector in the United States was seen as an antitrust 101 bald-faced attempt at trying to restrict trade. He came close to getting hit. And why is it important in the United States? Because unlike Canada, I have a little bit of a background in fighting and changing the Competition Act. Doesn't have a criminal test, has a civil test. It's limp-wristed in Canada, whereas the United States, as we saw from Rockefeller over 100 years ago, Americans are serious about antitrust. And Mr. Carney and his gang at bankers and investors would have been subject to triple damages. So every oil company, every natural gas company, every operator in the United States would have been able to sue Mr. Carney and all his members in GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which has been around since April of 2021, with triple damages. So let's say several $1 trillion. That really caused a lot of companies, including here in Canada, banks, to back off. And as a result, they recognize that this may be the bridge too far for now. It looks like GFANZ may have had a bit of a setback, but it's still going ahead around the world full steam.
So we're going to go to break. More on GFANZ and their impact on small to medium-sized business when we return on Canadian Innovators. Don't go away. Welcome back. I'm Jocelyn Bamford. My guest today is Dan McTeague, President of Canadians for Affordable Energy, and we are here discussing the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, also known as GFANZ. Dan, who is behind this organization? Can you shed some light on that?
Well, the United Nations Sustainability and Development Initiative is very much behind it. Michael Bloomberg, not a small player in terms of finance, also behind this. But every major bank and every major investment company in the United States and every major insurance company around the world signed on as members. And the idea was to sign up for the climate goals as a means of mitigating the effects of climate change. Now, we know Mark Carney in his book Values said a lot about the idea that, hey, we should have some way of being resilient to what is going on with respects to the climate change, which he apparently believes. But the idea that CO2, a molecule, a human emission, and some of it, most of it natural because it gets recycled into nature. I won't go down that long road. But the reality is that they felt that this is a way in which you can ensure that you're compliant to the objectives of the idea that we must reduce our carbon footprint. And that, of course, applies to most nations around the world, except for ones that we know have basically told GFANZ and other climate organizations to take a hike, namely Russia, China, and India. Those are some of the biggest emitters in the world. And although in Canada, Jocelyn, we're saddled with this idea, on a per capita basis, we're the largest emitters. Well, a few years ago in 2015, population of 35 million, cold country that was at that point an energy superpower. Of course, it's going to produce CO2. But if someone thinks that my exhaling is going to somehow cause weather to change, I think they're on another planet. And for that reason, GFANZ is not credible. It's an organization that, under rigorous anti-competition law, which we should have in Canada but don't, this thing would be lined up on the 30-yard line and punted right through the end zone. And of course, Mark Carney has found refuge in being prime minister, where he can sort of tiptoe around this, but make no mistake, he continues this. We remember last year, the clean fuel standard replaced the carbon tax, the consumer carbon tax. We have, as you very well know, perhaps better than others in your background, what an OBPS is. That's output-based pricing system, a so-called industrial carbon tax. And then layered on top of that, massive amounts of regulations that prevent companies and prevent individuals from doing what they're going to do. And it's going to get worse, not just because governments do it by regulation and fiat, by use of the so-called carrot rather than the stick, but now banks telling you and insurance companies saying, well, you won't get insurance if you don't do the following. Banks saying you won't get a loan if you don't do the following. Basically forcing us into a position where we have to accept this, even though the science is absolutely absurd.
So what do you think this is going to mean to small to medium-sized business? I'm already seeing the effects of this. We just received a non-disclosure for potential work where we had to sign on to their beliefs in net zero, and they actually wanted us to report to them what we were doing with greenhouse gases on an annual basis. I'm just painting your stuff. But talk to us about the greater impacts on small to medium-sized business.
Well, it's all about conformity. And if you don't conform, then you will be ostracized. You'll be cast out. And you will be subject to significant penalties, which make your business impossible, which is why, and I think it's fair to say, a lot of Canadian companies are deciding, if they haven't already, to get the hell out of Canada. And I don't want to be over dramatic about that point, but people have had enough. And the impact is not just on the businesses that stay here, it's the knock-on effect on consumers. It drives up our position, our cost of doing business, while our competitors are not subject to the same kind of burdens, financial burdens and regulatory burdens, which amount to making us less competitive. And it is, in essence, a way of ensuring, and this is why this is sort of seen as a global effort, It's one of the reasons I think we're seeing Canada moving towards Europe, because they believe that that's somehow a solution. We see that Europe, of course, is in real trouble for consumers and for Canadians. Our growth is going out the window. Our productivity is down, way down to levels that should have people screaming from the tops of buildings saying, how do we maintain our economic well-being if we don't have people innovating and creating opportunities and reinvesting in Canada? And unfortunately for business and small business entrepreneurs, go south, go east, go west, but don't stay in Canada, young man and woman.
We got to go to commercial. More when we continue on Canadian Innovators. Welcome back. I'm speaking with Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy, and we're discussing an organization called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Dan, let's listen to Prime Minister Mark Carney in his previous role as the Bank of England governor, talking about GFANZ in 2021, where he talks about a relentless focus on GFANZ. Let's take a listen.
I think our message on Wednesday to world leaders, to policymakers, to business people around the world is finance is going to be there, and finance is going to be there in two respects. One, we've retooled the financial system. We've changed the plumbing, if you will, the financial system, a bunch of very worthy reforms that actually, to be honest, only the audience at Bloomberg would fully understand and appreciate, and we can go through them for the next hour. But, you know, think mandatory disclosure, think stress testing, all that. So part is retooling, but then it's also about financial institutions stepping up and saying that they are going to finance this transition, this enormous $100 trillion transition that needs to happen over the next 3 decades. They're going to finance it, and they're going to mark their own homework. They're going to show up year in, year out, say what their emissions are of their clients, have specific strategies for reducing carbon, fair share of 50% down by 2030. That's what the Glasgow Financial Alliance is all about.
So, Dan, is Mark Carney really advocating that companies will have to report to their banks and their insurance companies their emissions?
Yes, that's what he's saying. That's what he said. And that's obviously what's still going on. I'm, as a son of a master plumber and steam fitter, I'm always interested in people's analogy to plumbing, because even though you materially wreck the internal infrastructure of economies, you still wind up having to put that effluent somewhere. In this case, I think what it's doing is there's a backflow here, and the backflow is damaging to the economy. But we are on target for seeing major disruption of our economies. And you'll note he didn't say pollution or other things in terms of environmental goals, which I think we all would want to pursue, which Canada's done an extraordinarily good job at. When I compare, our cities and being concerned about plastics, and I see what goes on in Bangladesh or Pakistan, I'm not pointing fingers, but saying, my God, I mean, what are we doing here? But Mark Carney is the man who conceived and was the leader for all this. And what it does do is it's not just highly disruptive, it's absolutely damaging to consumers who are still trying to figure out why the cost of living has gone through the roof and why we're in a recession. And like most other G7, G20, OECD countries, why we find ourselves in such a position. Well, it has a lot to do with conflicting message, more regulatory red tape to do everything, and conditions by which we're not even talking regulators, but those for which we and whom we do business, who are part of the financial infrastructure by which we survive as business, are now in charge of serving as really monitors for the things that we do. And if we fail in those regards, we lose that credit, we lose that social standing, we lose the ability to be competitive.
So, Dan, this GFANZ group could control and even destroy small to medium-sized business. What can small to medium-sized business owners do to push back?
I've served the Liberal Party for 40 years, NDP and Green. They're all part of the same thing. These people have never met, have never had to balance books, much less meet payroll. And I think at the end of the day, they believe their own press releases and think that what they're doing is somehow cool and trendy. That might have been true in 2014, 2015, when the world and Canada had a very strong financial balance sheet. We've lost that. And when I see young people, and I speak to many of them saying, yeah, we sort of get this because we've been indoctrinated about this since we were in kindergarten, they now realize their future is no longer in Canada. And I think it's time for my generation, the boomers, to wake the hell up, stop being so bloody selfish and so ignorant, and stop being so narrow-minded on a policy that really benefits the people, the Mark Carneys of this world, with carbon credits. Think about it, the carbon credit market, which they also control, someone doesn't do anything productive, leaves their land fallow, does whatever they can, doesn't have a new technology, just doesn't do anything. They get a credit for that. You give them a couple $1,000,000 for that, usually publicly funded, unless it's coming from the private sector. We have eclipsed the reasons by which people want to innovate in this country, because there's no technology that's going to get us to net zero, not without destroying the country and reducing most of its consumers to a position of having net zero in terms of finances.
We're going to talk more about GFANZ when we continue on Canadian Innovators. We're going to commercial. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back. I'm speaking with Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Dan, let's talk about the USMCA trade deal. In your opinion, what is happening between Canada and the US with regards to trade?
Hubris on the Canadian side, and of course, uncertainty on the US side. We know that President Trump can change his mind very quickly, but what is not for debate is the fact that Canadians have arrogantly suggested perhaps it's more important to take an elbows up approach, divining the idea of what Gordie Howe used to do when he played for the Detroit Red Wings. And I think that's a nice idea, except that a year and a half after that nonsense, the country is truly ankles up. And for that reason, I think it's critical that people understand we haven't made a serious attempt at addressing the grievances the Americans hold. And we haven't also returned that by saying there are grievances that Canadians hold in terms of how US uses subsidies to help certain industries. There's a lot of areas where we can complain about what they're doing, but we haven't moved an inch on issues like supply management. We haven't moved an inch on forestry. Instead, we're willing to say, let's just take booze off the shelves and that'll teach them. Look, I think it's in our interest to recognize pragmatically, and that's where I'm coming from as a liberal. I come from the pragmatic side of things, where you look at things realistically and say things, we can do certain things, we can't do other things. The Americans aren't necessarily going to agree with us on everything, and we don't have to do the same with them. There's a significant amount of tradition and goodwill that still exists among the American people and Canadian people. But I would say that our hubris, our arrogance, and our way of saying, oh, the Americans are second, we're way better than them, you've got to get over yourselves. This is the real world, and the world trading relationship established a century ago has now disintegrated, and it has to be bilateral and on issue by issue. And if we can resolve a good part of those, I think this thing would be gone, but we're not even trying. We're pretending this is 1970, and it is no longer that kind of a world. More importantly, if Canada can't play the argument of its energy prowess and prove to the world that it can build pipelines, we can't turn around and say, well, we can play the Americans, as Doug Ford is suggesting, and others, oh, we should play the energy issue and cut them off. We do that, we cut our noses off to spite our faces. We're here in Ontario right now. All of our energy that comes from Canada has to transit through the United States. And so we have to put a little bit of water with our wine and recognize that what has given us the prosperity of that relationship, which is unequaled in the world, is not there for short-term political compromise by my old liberal friends who think that it's cool and cute to pretend you can make a deal with Europe, or worse, with communist, totalitarian, authoritarian, censor-prone China. If we go down these roads, we will never return as a nation. I wouldn't be surprised that the next century will see the disintegration of Canada, unless it works now hard, strenuously, to get a better rapport with our American friends and trading partners.
So, Dan, you're a former Liberal cabinet minister. If you were to give advice to the government, what would you say to them?
Get off your duff. Pick up the phone. Take a bit of humble pie. Stop this business of pretending you can win elections as liberals while destroying the country. There has to come a point where the future generation of liberals recognize that being pragmatic and open is the way in which we proceed. We stormed the beaches of Normandy. We had one of five of the areas that Britain took two, America took two, we took one. We have to recognize that we're not the biggest nation on the face of this planet. And our prosperity, our way of thinking, our freedoms, our liberties, our customs, our democracy depends very heavily on a relationship with a big brother who's always been for us, and we've been there for them. And I think they recognize that. That's what we should be divining. That's what we should be talking about, the things that we have in common rather than the things that divide us. And whether it's Mr. Trump or any other president, just because they're Democrats elected in the United States doesn't mean they're your friends. Look what he did with the IRA. Look what he did with the Inflation Reduction Act, which damaged the Canadian auto sector. Look at what Biden and the Democrats did with the Keystone XL, and Obama with the Keystone XL pipeline. Not only important for them, but also important for us. They killed it. So let's not play this partisan game as liberals have done. Oh, we love the Democrats. In fact, we'll allow them to come over here and take over our Prime Minister's office. That to me is shameful. That is wrong. Imagine if a conservative was in power and Harper had elected or brought in someone from the Republican Party to run his office back in the period 2006 to 2011. He would have been hung, or 2015. He would have been hung from the highest tree we could find in this country. But we have to get ahead of the arrogance by which we have conducted ourselves up to now. I know we need to know that we're good people, but we need to do that now.
We're going to have to leave it there, Dan. Great conversation as always. Please come back again. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching Canadian Innovators, and we'll see you next time.